This is the Norfolk Polish Heritage Group Archive Project. Today is the 26th of March 2019 and I've come to Swardston in Norfolk to interview a Pole who has a fascinating story to tell us. Good morning.
Dzień dobry.
Dzień dobry. What is your name, please?
Jerzy Franciszek Bączkowski.
But I believe you're known as Kuba to your friends.
Kuba in the Polish world.
Very good. And how long have you lived in Norfolk?
Since 1948 with breaks.
And those breaks were in...
I left when I was in 1957 to university and returned in 1971 to work for Air Anglia and returned again in 2001 in retirement.
And of course you've got a very Polish name, so I understand that you may have Polish parents.
Both my parents are Polish. Father was Jan Bączkowski and mother was Irena née Zabłocka.
And let's start first of all by talking about your parents, and we'll hear your story a little bit later. When was your father born and where was he born?
Father was born in Dębsk in 1898.
And Dębsk is what sort of area of Poland is that?
It's western Poland, near Łowicz.
Near Łowicz. And do you know where your mother was born and when she was born?
Mother was born in 1902 in Kiev, in the Ukraine.
And what did your father do?
Father was a boy soldier in the First World War after agricultural college and became a professional cavalry officer.
And I understand that he was involved in the scouting movement.
He was heavily involved in the scouting movement, which was a type of underground when Poland didn't exist.
And what was your mother's background?
Mother came from a very powerful landed family in the Ukraine, and all was lost in the Russian Revolution.
And your father was involved in the First World War. What was his? Which part of the army did he?
He was in the infantry, presumably under the Russians against the Germans.
And I think that was in the cavalry, was it as well?
That was later.
A little bit later.
After the war, when Poland was formed, he went to military school and became a professional cavalry officer.
So he was a career officer. He spent a lot of his life in the army.
The whole life was in the Polish army.
And your mother, what?
Mother worked for the Polish government in agriculture. She was a specialist in horticulture and animal husbandry and worked for the government until the war broke out.
And when were they married?
They were married in 1938 in Warsaw.
Now, I understand that your father was captured very early by the Russians. Tell me about that, please.
Both were captured. He was commanding officer of an outpost in Białystok on the eastern side, which was overwhelmed by the Russians when they entered Poland. And both were put in a holding camp, a prison camp in Lida in Latvia.
And they were lucky to have not been taken away by the Russians.
My mother escaped first. She was working as a nurse and persuaded my father that he has to flee, so they did, and through Latvia and Estonia to Sweden.
How did she escape? Do you have any background on that?
I think as she was nursing in the camp hospital, so I think she had a fairly easy access in and out.
Because I believe that some of his colleagues that were in that camp were later taken away to Katyn and murdered by the Russians in Katyn.
Yes, it broke my father. He's very moved by it.
Indeed, it was the Polish officers and the intelligentsia that were rounded up.
Yes, yeah.
And what was the journey from when they escaped? How did that develop?
They went by fishing boat to Sweden.
They were travelling together?
Yes. The Polish embassy in Stockholm gave them passage by air to Brussels. And from there they made their way to Paris, where he joined General czkowski as a staff officer in the newly forming Free Polish Army.
And I understand that your father was one of the very earliest people to join czkowski.
Number 47 in the Free Polish Forces.
So you know that number, that's documented.
It's documented, yes.
Good heavens. And I imagine that he must have had close contact with czkowski because, of course, czkowski is one of the most famous names in Polish history.
He would have done. It was such a small unit at the time, just forming that, yes.
And when France fell, what happened to your father?
The Polish remnants of the Polish forces, British, French, whatever, made their way west and right up to Cherbourg. And father was evacuated from Cherbourg in 1940 by a Polish destroyer sent by czkowski.
And I understand that evacuation, that last ship that left France, it disobeyed Churchill's instructions.
Churchill had ordered the evacuation to cease, but he had no command over the Polish forces. They were independent. So czkowski sent 2 Polish destroyers to Cherbourg.
Mm-hmm. And this was after the Dunkirk evacuations?
Yes, yeah.
Do you know roughly when that was?
It was June 1940.
June of 1940. Mm-hmm. And your mother, though, wasn't able to escape.
My mother was trapped in Paris because I had arrived in March.
So she was pregnant and couldn't travel. Your father went off and
had to abandon her
and landed up in Britain. So how did she then escape from France?
She walked across France to Nice, where she fell into the hands of the Red Cross and was then stayed in Antibes and Nice for nearly 2 years, or a year by the time she'd walked.
With you in tow, of course.
Mm-hmm.
You told me an anecdote about Hitler.
My mother stayed in Paris long enough to watch Hitler's victory parade, which was in June, and she held me up and pointed Hitler out and said, he's the cause of our problems. So yes, I've seen Hitler. So
she held you up above her head?
Yes.
But you have no recollection of that because you were very young?
Not at 3 months.
No, indeed. So I understand then she walked south, of course, into Vichy, France, mm-hmm. away from the occupied north of mm-hmm. France. And how did she travel then beyond France?
She was in Nice and Antibes until the Germans came in, and then she walked across the Pyrenees
Across the Pyrenees?
Yes, across the famous bomber escape route to Spain.
Via Madrid, I believe?
The Spanish were sending most of the illegal entrants back to France, but because it was a mother and child, with a friend who was another mother and child, they put them on the train to Madrid, where there was a Polish legation. And
then made their way to Lisbon.
They gave both the families, my mother and the other lady, passage to Lisbon. The other lady was put on a ship for Britain, which was torpedoed, and she was lost. My mother was put on a flying boat on BOAC and flew to Britain via Shannon and Poole.
Now, there's a bit of a mystery about how your mother managed to get onto the flying boat. Could you tell me about that?
The Sunderland was the equivalent of Concorde. It was very, very VIP. It only seated 14 passengers. So how my mother with a child got passage on it is a mystery.
But I understand you still have the receipt for that.
Paid for by my father, £375, but...
Which was a huge amount of money.
A huge amount of money. I suspect she was carrying documents, which she'd done before.
Because she worked with the resistance
She did,
in Nice, was that?
Nice, yes, she did. Yeah.
And that was working to try to sabotage?
She called it the Fifth Column, run by Poles, bringing in money from Switzerland to fund the resistance.
That's a remarkable story. So she then came to Britain, but had lost touch with your father, I think.
The military authorities, when she landed, soon got in touch with him.
They did, and they met up. And what then was your father doing in Britain?
Father was in charge of B train on the Dymchurch Romney Hythe armoured train.
Tell me about that, please.
It was a miniature railway which still runs to this day, and it was armoured for the war with light ack anti-aircraft.
And was that a defensive
Defensive.
system in case of an invasion?
Yes, yeah. The landing was always expected to be in Kent.
So what happened with the rest of his war? He was, of course, in the Polish army at that stage.
It's a blank, but he went to Scotland, where he was involved in training most of the time, and then he was camp commandant for a couple of resettlement camps.
And by that time he'd actually then joined the British army, had he?
At the end of the war, when the Polish army was demobbed, he joined the British army as a second lieutenant and camp commandant of resettlement camps.
But he was a major in the Polish army.
A major in the Polish army.
And I see from his records that he had some distinguished medals and awards.
He had the highest gallantry medal, the Virtuti Militari from Poland from the First World War, for taking out a machine gun nest, he always told me.
So is that the sort of equivalent of the George Cross or the Victoria Military Cross?
Military Cross, I'd have said.
Indeed.
And that must have been in the 1920 campaign against the Russians.
And while your father was organising the 3 resettlement camps, the people who were being resettled were, of course, Polish military people. Mm-hmm. What was your mother doing?
She taught English because she spoke very good English, and also horticulture.
I understand she was quite a linguist. How many languages?
7 languages fluently.
What were they? Can you remember?
Polish, Russian, Ukrainian, English, French and German. That, like, off the top of my head.
So she presumably was a very well-educated woman.
She was, yes.
So your father, as most Poles, was demobbed in 1948. Mm-hmm. What did he do then?
My parents came to Norfolk and took up farming in Fulham Market.
Why did they choose Norfolk?
Because it reminded them of Poland. It was very similar in feel, agriculture, still a horse and wagon culture in those days in Norfolk.
And they went into partnership. It was a family partnership.
With her brother.
With your mother's brother.
Mm-hmm.
And what sort of farming did they do?
Mixed cattle.
Some arable?
Black arable, black currants, mm-hmm. Chickens, poultry farming.
And how long were they involved in that?
They were there roughly 5 years, and my father got cancer and was seriously ill. So the partner pulled out and the farm became bankrupt.
Oh dear.
And we moved to Wood Green, Long Stratton.
To Long Stratton. But then eventually I think you moved again to London.
My mother taught in the Notre Dame until 1958.
So that's the Notre Dame School?